1980, an era remembered by many as a time of glory due to the freedom and excesses with which the unbridled youth of that time lived, between parties, alcohol, and the unbridled consumption of drugs, which gave way to the well-known crack epidemic in the United States, a period that began in the 80s and that would cease with the arrival of the 90s after a relentless struggle on the part of the FBI to put an end to the drug trafficking networks that were turning a whole generation addicted to cocaine due to its low cost, which allowed anyone to have access to it, since a dose of crack as a drug derived from cocaine cost only $2.50. So, it was not difficult for young people to pay for it. It was as if it were a candy or a soda that began to consume it day by day without problems, filling the pockets of its distributors and generating a malaise to the American society that had to deal not only with the growing rate of addicts as a public health problem, but with all the criminal activities that arose in the middle of the sales of this narcotic, where violence took over the streets of North America through robberies and murders perpetrated by criminal gangs dedicated to drug trafficking, an epidemic from which the authorities did not come out unscathed and perhaps indirectly formed the youngest drug trafficker ever known in the history of the United States, and who is also known for being the youngest man to work for the FBI, Richard Wershe Jr., popularized by the name of White Boy Rick, who was only 14 years old when he obtained the position of FBI informant, all because of a game of manipulation by the authorities in their desire to dismantle the drug trafficking networks in Detroit, one of the American cities that by then was gaining a reputation for crime and violence, largely due to the influx of cocaine and the place where the young informant resided. But why did the FBI choose Richard Wershe Jr. at such a young age to be their informant? And how did they turn him into a drug trafficker? Wershe was born on July 18, 1960, and his father, who at that time was also a police informant, was dedicated to selling stolen goods, especially weapons, which he sold directly to criminal gangs. He sold them directly to criminal gangs, something that the authorities knew, but they turned a blind eye in exchange for the information that Wershe Sr. provided them. But it was these criminal activities of his father that led him to work for the FBI and to be linked to the network of cocaine distributors. When in 1984, father and son were seen in a clandestine auction fair buying weapons for subsequent marketing. It seems that Mr. Wershe was teaching his son how arms trafficking worked, without realizing that they were being spied on by the police. And once they left that fair, they went home, and once there, they both set up to unpack everything they had bought. While they were doing it, Wershe's father commented to his son that in the arms business is not only to know which weapons are the best to buy and then sell them. So, the next day Rick leaves the house with a big briefcase in his hand, gets in the car, and goes to the address his father gave him to make the delivery, where he goes without knowing that the police are following him. Upon arriving at the site, he performs a security protocol to enter the lair of the criminals to whom he is going to offer his shipment, and who end up accepting not only the rifles that he was carrying, but ended up buying some silencers that were not part of the negotiation that they had made with his father. This makes the young man earn the admiration of everyone for his astute way of selling, so much so that Boo, Johnny's younger brother, the leader of the gang, offers him his friendship and invites him to celebrate the closing of the business in a youth nightclub. A fact that ends up surprising the agents, since young Rick had achieved something that his father had not achieved, and was to be within the inner circle of Johnny's gang, the main gang of drug dealers in Detroit. And it was just at this moment, when the FBI thought that Rick was the informant, they needed to dismantle Johnny's gang. So, a few days after finally confirming that Rick had become friends with the criminal cartel, the agents visited his father to ask for permission to involve the boy as an FBI informant, but he refused, because he knew how dangerous this would be for his son if he was discovered. So the agents left, but all this did not stop there, and looked for a way for the young man to provide them with the information they needed to break up the drug gang to which Rick had access. After that meeting between the police agents and Rick's father, a few days passed, and the agents tried again to interact with the young man. But this time, they went to him without his father's knowledge and forced him to get into his car for a ride in which began the FBI's manipulation game to make Rick an informant and a drug dealer, because they notified him that with one of the illegal weapons that his father was selling, a murder had been committed. So if he did not want his father to be arrested and put to the order of the law, it was better that he help them, because otherwise his father would end up behind bars. So, before this game of intimidation, Rick ended up accepting, and the FBI involving a young minor in their espionage operations. But there was something that also motivated Rick, and was the millionaire salary of more than $10,000 that they promised him if he worked for them secretly, without his father or anyone else knowing about it. And after that meeting, having convinced the FBI that the boy would help them, they parked the car a few blocks from his house and let him go, telling him to be on the lookout, that they would contact him again soon. After a few days, while the boy was riding his bicycle through the neighborhood, the agent's car approached him and asked him to get in. And once he got in, they gave him a package with a few grams of cocaine to distribute it. And in this way, he would begin to make a name for himself in the criminal world. And in the same way, he could gain even more trust from the Johnny gang by projecting himself as a young man willing to do anything without fear of anything. They simply wanted him to be seen as a criminal with a promising future in the criminal world, without thinking that this game would end up becoming a reality. Already Rick, with his first drug merchandise to distribute, went immediately to tell his friend, Boo, that he would undertake a new business independently and without help from his father, because he wanted to build his own empire. And that was his savings. He had managed to buy a few grams of cocaine, which would be dedicated to sell. And in such a way, he did it outside the high schools, nightclubs, other places perfectly calculated for the sale. And little by little, he was relating more with the people that the FBI wanted. Not to mention that the plan to make the white boy look like an elite criminal worked, as Rick managed to captivate everyone with his new extravagant lifestyle and success on the streets, which allowed him to be accepted even more into Johnny's gang, and also aroused the admiration of the girls all over Detroit. And finally, gain enough credibility as a legitimate drug supplier on the streets of Detroit, without raising a single suspicion that he was sharing information with the police about what his friends and drug associates were doing, because Rick was so skillful and cautious that Johnny's gang never suspected that he was the guy who was informing the police of their criminal activities. Rick's fame and leadership, even if he was 14, 15, or 16 years old, made him a god who was on a par with the bosses of these gangs. Because let's remember that he entered the cocaine business apparently as his own boss, so it was impossible to believe that he wanted to end the business. So seen as someone to trust, Rick began at his young age to amass a great fortune and to add with it a large list of enemies, because the gang that the FBI had commissioned him to spy was quite dangerous, and that he realized on a trip he made with Johnny's gang. But before leaving, Rick met with his FBI bosses to inform them that he would leave the city with the gang, who gave him a lot of money for the trip. Then Rick went home and packed his suitcase. He waited for them to pick him up, and once Rick got into Johnny's limousine, and they went to the airport to take the flight that would take him to the city of sin, where the glamour and luxuries were not long in coming, as they were received as television stars and stayed in an eccentric hotel. But everything got out of control when they arrived the night they were going to see the fight for which he had gone to Las Vegas, as they could not enter the enclosure where the boxing match would take because the tickets that Johnny had set aside for him and his band to enter to enjoy the fight were sold. And not only that, but these were bought by Johnny's enemy band. So he angrily left the place and went to one of the dazzling bars in the city to watch the fight on a big screen, where hours later, the enemy squad arrived, and as expected, the mood was altered, and Johnny hit his rival's friend, Black Ed, with a bottle of champagne. Subsequently, he ordered a drive-by assault and attack on the house of his rival, Leon Lucas, where he ended up killing one of his young nephews. At this moment, he reacts and realizes that his friends not only sell drugs, but that they are engaged in acts of vandalism, because he innocently believed that the weapons were to defend themselves from the police and not to kill anyone. But he was wrong. And the worst thing was that the weapons they used were the same ones he had sold them in Detroit. And while he was in Las Vegas, his father took the opportunity to check his room, because he sensed that his son was hiding something from him, as he knew that the money he was giving him was not enough to afford all the luxuries that his son was flaunting lately. And she proved that her suspicions were true when she found thousands of dollars in illicit cash under Rick's bed. So once he arrived from that trip, she confronted him, and the young man, who prefers to tell her that he wants to be a delinquent, decided to leave home without telling her that he was working for the police, because he wanted to protect him and avoid being imprisoned. But once out of the house, begins to live a life under his free will and without limits. But with the murder he had witnessed in principle, preferred to stay away from the gang Johnny, something that made the gang leader suspected that he was the one who was passing information to the police of their movements. So whether or not the informant Johnny were trying to get away from the gang of the mafia and sent a hitman, who was a friend of Ricky, to his house to kill him because Rick knew too much about them for him to be alive. But although the hitman shot him in the stomach, Rick, although he fell to the ground by the impact of the bullet, managed to survive after he was seriously taken to the hospital, moment in which Rick reflected and saw that it was time to totally denounce Johnny. Because before he had not done it, because he had become accustomed to the life of luxury, money, and girls. And he didn't want to lose all that. But now that his life was in danger, he took the decision to give all the data to the FBI to raid all the gambling and drug dealing houses of Johnny, who was finally arrested in one of these raids by the FBI, leaving Rick to Johnny out of the business, thanks to his information. Once Johnny was incarcerated, he was sentenced to 20 years in a maximum security prison. And so the FBI said mission accomplished, because they already had Johnny and all his men behind bars, an action with which they thought they had managed to largely purge the streets of Detroit of cocaine, since they had arrested the main gang of distributors of the drug. Rick was asked to continue being part of the team of informants, since he had done a great job. But as they knew that he was tormented by all the crimes he witnessed, he was also asked to forget all that this is not his responsibility, and that in the midst of crime and justice will always see blood spilled. But at that moment, the young man decided that this is best to return to live with his father and not return to work for the FBI, and also decided to stay away from the criminal gangs. But this was not for long. His desire to live surrounded by luxury and power made him return in 1987 to the streets to sell crack, because he had learned very well how the business worked. Besides that, he had already made a name for killing Johnny and his gang. So it was not difficult for him to take Johnny's place in the mafia, because the power that Rick enjoyed at that time made Johnny's wife accepted to have sex with him, because he felt so supreme that he believed he could have everything he wanted. With the passage of time, and having already managed to earn a fortune as the main drug dealer in Detroit, Rick sets out to realize his father's dream of opening a video store, business that takes advantage to launder all the illicit money he had, which allows him to grow his financial fortune, with which he is ready to live surrounded by comforts and luxuries, such as jewelry and late-model cars. But in the same way, his reign as Johnny's came to an end, because one day FBI agents arrest Rick. They raid his house and detain him for possession of drugs, which he was selling comfortably in the streets, thanks to the fact that he was the new leader of the streets by creating the criminal gang that succeeded Johnny's. And although Johnny was only sentenced to 20 years, Rick was sentenced to life imprisonment, regardless of the fact that he had previously collaborated with justice and the authorities. So, without mercy, and forgetting that it was the FBI who introduced him to that world, he was sentenced to life imprisonment in Michigan under the state's 650 Lifer Act, a drug statute passed in 1973 that at that time penalized with life imprisonment without parole those who were in possession of more than 650 grams of cocaine or heroin. And although the law was repealed a few years later, and those who had been arrested and sentenced under this law could apply for parole, but Rick was denied that benefit, as he was considered a danger to society. So they preferred to leave him in prison without the right to anything. But behind this, there was something else, and that was that his accusation against Johnny did not only make the drug dealer went to jail, but family and associates of former Detroit Mayor Coleman Young, as the family of former mayor was engaged in this illicit business because one of his nieces was married to Johnny, the man who led much of the 80s drug sales in Detroit. But nevertheless, Rick managed to get off the streets after his story became famous in 2017 when justice activists made his case known to the press, a story that generated uproar, as the FBI had forced a child to commit crime for their own interests and now punished him severely for something they themselves led him to, claiming that although his father was a criminal, his degree of crime was not as serious as what the FBI did with Rick, as they made it known that Rick Wershe was a single father with economic difficulties who had to live in Detroit of the 80s, where the economy declined, so doing some illicit activities are done to survive. And the only thing Rick's father did was to buy used guns in the state of Ohio, repair them, and make parts to improve them, and then sell them illegally in Detroit to earn more money and thus make ends meet. But that even so, what the FBI had done was more horrible. So once this case was brought to light, the press began to talk about it again and again. So much so that 2017, a documentary called White Boy was made. A documentary that narrates the case of Richard Wershe Jr., and which premiered on March 31st, 2017 at the Freep Film Festival, where it won the Audience Award and from there, it began to be broadcast on the Starz network in 2019 and was acquired by Netflix in April 2021. But this was not the only production made based on Rick's story, since in 2018 to the big screen came White Boy Rick, a film based on the life of the young man, a film also known as Game is Betrayal, directed by Jan Demange, where the central character is played by Richie Merritt, accompanied by Oscar winner Matthew McConaughey, who assumes the role of his father. The two star in an intimate story that explores family dynamics marked by desperation and the struggle to find a way out of poverty, no matter the cost. The screenplay, written by Andy Weiss, with brothers Logan and Noah Miller, makes a critical argument against government actions, questioning the decisions and ethics behind the FBI's use of teenage informants. After these productions, and the hundreds of articles and press reports that made White Boy Rick's case famous, Rick was able to get the authorities to grant him parole. But before his release, he had to spend 5 more years in Florida State Prison for the crime of grand theft auto, a crime he was proven to have committed from prison. However, he was released early, and on July 20th, 2020, Wershe was released from custody in Florida, having completed his sentence with good behavior credits. On the other hand, it should be noted that White Boy Rick is not a nickname that Richard Wershe Jr. has earned in the streets while he was a delinquent, because he never called himself that way. Nor was it a name that his peers called him, because this is not a street nickname. So this name with which Rick is known today is attributed to the journalist who covered his case and who reviewed his story using that name. And although he lived in prison for almost 3 decades, this did not prevent him from having a family, as it is said that this man had a relationship with a woman who constantly visited him in prison, a relationship from which a girl was born. And although we do not have much information about the latter, what we do know is that in July 2021, Wershe sued the FBI and stated in the lawsuit that, had I not been a task force informant, I would never have been involved with the drug gangs or any type of criminality, and that the FBI's actions amounted to abuse. And unsurprisingly, 3 years after the lawsuit, the authorities have not spoken out because they are not going to punish themselves for their own crimes. Meanwhile, Rick continues to appear on different TV channels and social networks telling his story, how he went from being a normal young man to an FBI informant to a drug trafficker, who for years was denied his rights.